You are nothing more than a legacy dependency. We are sunsetting tonight, Julian. So hand over your badge before security escorts you into the alley like the rest of the trash. That was what Arthur Vance, the vice president of infrastructure at Apex Logistics Solutions, said to me at precisely 4:15 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in front of 64 silent software engineers, project managers, and executive directors in the main third-floor atrium. My name is Julian Vance. I am 34 years old. This is the story of how my uncle built a multi-million-dollar automated shipping empire on 20 years of my invisible labor. Replaced me with an off-the-shelf artificial intelligence script he didn't understand. And then realized within 72 hours that I was the only human being on Earth who held the master cryptographic keys to the entire global supply chain. By the time he came crawling to my studio apartment in the rain, begging for the password that was keeping 96 cargo ships idling in international waters, the price of my consultation had gone up from $85 an hour to $42 million cash. Apex Logistics Solutions was not built in a sleek Silicon Valley glass tower. It was birthed in a converted industrial garage in South Baltimore, smelling perpetually of stale Folgers coffee, damp cardboard, engine degreaser, and the ozone tang of overheating CRT monitors. My father, Richard Vance, was the mechanical heart of the original operation. He was a man with grease, stained permanently into the whorls of his thumbs, who could listen to the idle of a diesel engine or the clatter of a conveyor belt and tell you which bearing was going to fail 3 weeks before it snapped. Arthur was his younger brother, a man whose fingers had never known a callus, whose eyes were always darting toward the nearest mirror, and whose voice possessed a slick, velvet cadence that could convince a starving dog that a bone was just around the corner. In our family, there was a strict, unwritten but absolute hierarchy. At the absolute summit sat Arthur, the visionary salesman, the corporate face, the man who wore $600 charcoal suits even when the roof was leaking into bucket rows in the sorting bay. Below him was his son, my cousin Mark, a boy raised on unearned praise, private schooling, and the absolute conviction that effort was something required only of people who didn't share his surname. At the bottom of that hierarchy sat my father and me. My father was the pack mule who kept the physical fleet moving, and I was the quiet kid in the corner who started writing Turbo Pascal code at 12 to map his delivery routes. When my father died of a sudden, catastrophic stroke at the age of 48, I was 19 years old. The grease-stained boots were still sitting by the back door when Arthur sat me down in the garage office, surrounded by the smell of my father's leftover menthol cigarettes and old motor oil. He placed a heavy, manicured hand on my shoulder, looked me dead in the eye, and delivered the gospel that would bind me for the next 15 years. "Julian," Arthur had whispered, his voice trembling with a masterfully performative grief, "your father was the soul of this company, but he left us in deep debt. We owe the banks $412,000. If we don't hold this line together, your mother loses the house, Mark loses his college tuition, and your father's memory gets dragged through bankruptcy court. You carry his mind for systems, boy. You step up into his shoes, you handle the code, and I will make sure this family never starves. You are a partner in this, even if the paper doesn't say so yet." Blood protects blood. I believed him. At 19, grief makes you remarkably pliable, and the promise of protecting my widowed mother was an anchor I grabbed with both hands. So began the structure of my life. Arthur took the title of founder and chief executive officer. Mark, upon graduating with a C- average from a mid-tier business college, was immediately installed as senior vice president of innovation, complete with a $165,000 salary, a company-leased BMW M5, and an office with floor-to-ceiling glass. I was given the title of lead systems architect, a grand name for a man who worked 80 hours a week in a windowless basement server room that smelled of hot copper, dust, and ozone. Earning $62,000 a year without a single share of equity. The entire operational engine of Apex Logistics was built upon a proprietary, deeply customized software suite called Aegis. I wrote every single line of Aegis from scratch over 15 years. It wasn't just an inventory tracker. It was a living, breathing digital nervous system. It calculated real-time maritime weather patterns, port congestion indexes, diesel price fluctuations, customs clearing delays in 48 countries, and driver fatigue metrics. Aegis could reroute a fleet of 300 refrigerated tractor-trailers around a sudden ice storm in Nebraska before the first snowflake touched the asphalt, saving millions of dollars in spoiled produce. To the outside world, Apex Logistics was a tech-forward logistics juggernaut pulling in $210 million in annual revenue. To the board of directors and the venture capital investors Arthur began courting in the early 2020s. The magical efficiency of Apex was attributed entirely to Arthur Vance's visionary executive leadership and Mark Vance's cutting-edge strategic innovation. My name appeared nowhere in the prospectus. I was simply the line item labeled Internal Infrastructure Maintenance on the quarterly budget reports, a necessary, unglamorous overhead cost. Every morning, I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m. I would walk past Mark's glass office, usually empty until 11:00 a.m., smelling the faint lingering trail of his expensive Tom Ford cologne. I would sit down at my desk, 3 monitors, an ergonomic keyboard with worn-down lettering on the keycaps, and a lukewarm mug of black tea, and quiet the digital fires that kept Arthur's empire from collapsing into dust. I knew every anomaly in the code. I knew that the database tables for the Rotterdam shipping lanes had a race condition that would lock up the entire server cluster if more than 4,000 containers cleared customs simultaneously. So I had written a custom thread synchronization daemon, a quiet little script I named *Sentinel*, that ran in the background, manually smoothing out the data spikes every 11 minutes. I knew that the legacy hardware bridges connecting our legacy warehouse scanners in Baltimore to the cloud servers were held together by a series of custom virtual ports I maintained personally. Aegis wasn't just software. It was a bespoke clockwork engine, and I was the only clockmaker who knew where the hidden gears were hidden. The slights were never sudden. They were a slow, methodical dripping of water designed to wear down my sense of self-worth, until I believed I was entirely unviable outside the walls of Apex Logistics. The first major escalation occurred in the autumn of 2021. I had spent 8 consecutive weeks working 20-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the server room, to engineer a complete overhaul of our supply chain routing algorithm. The new update, which I named Root Core 4, reduced total fuel consumption across our domestic shipping lines by 14.2%, instantly saving the company $3.8 million in a single quarter. At the annual company gala held at the Harbor Hotel, a lavish affair where 300 guests drank $50 glass scotch under crystal chandeliers, Arthur stood at the podium in a tailored tuxedo. When I conceived the root core architecture, Arthur announced to the applauding room, his voice booming over the speakers while Mark stood beside him smiling. I knew we were going to revolutionize green logistics. Mark and I spent endless nights refining this vision to ensure Apex remains the market leader. I was sitting at table 24, located in the back corner near the kitchen doors, where the clatter of dirty dishes and the smell of roasted garlic and lemon detergent drowned out half the speeches. I was wearing a 6-year-old off-the-rack suit that felt tight around the shoulders. When I brought up the omission to Arthur the following Monday in his office, which smelled of rich leather polish and mahogany, he simply poured himself a glass of sparkling water, looked at me with deep, theatrical pity and sighed. "Julian, please don't let your ego cloud your judgment," Arthur said softly, swirling the water. "Clients don't buy code written by a guy in a basement. They buy the vision. They buy *us*. You get a steady paycheck, zero liability, and absolute job security. If I put your name on that stage, the investors start asking questions about keyman risk, the stock valuation drops, and everybody loses, including your mother, whose medical supplemental insurance this company covers out of respect for your late father. You want to hurt your mother over a little bit of credit. He used my mother as his primary lever for a decade. Every time I asked for a raise, every time I requested stock options, every time I asked for an assistant to help with the 3:00 a.m. system alerts, Arthur would evoke my father's memory and my mother's insurance policy. The second scene of escalation occurred in June 2024. Mark was promoted to Chief Technology Officer. He was 31 years old, had never written a single line of code in his life, and thought Python was exclusively a reptile. To mark his appointment, Mark called a mandatory engineering department meeting in the main executive boardroom. The air in the room was cold, smelling of fresh dry erase markers and mint tea. Mark stood at the head of the conference table, wearing a $2,000 Italian suit, holding a laser pointer like a baton. Moving forward, Mark declared, clicking to a slide titled *Streamlining and Modernization, we are eliminating red tape. All technical architecture decisions will run through my office. We've noticed a lot of redundant, legacy code in the system, specifically the background daemons written by legacy staff. It's messy. It's inefficient. We need modern, clean solutions, not old-school patches held together by duct tape. He was looking directly at me. Sitting around the table were 6 young junior developers, fresh out of university, who had been hired at higher starting salaries than I was currently making after 15 years. Mark, I said quietly, my hands resting flat on the mahogany table, keeping my voice entirely level. The legacy daemons you are referring to handle the port protocol translation for our top 3 overseas shipping lines. If you remove them without updating the API bridges in Antwerp, the entire European tracking network goes dark. Mark chuckled, a patronizing, high-pitched sound that echoed in the quiet room. He pointed the red laser dot directly at the center of my chest. Julian, Mark said, his smile tight and condescending, you've been sitting in that basement so long you think the sun revolves around your terminal. Technology has moved past you. You think in terms of lines of code. I think in terms of global infrastructure scale. Learn your place in the modern stack, or the modern stack will execute around you. The junior developers looked down at their laptops in uncomfortable silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flush red. I simply adjusted my glasses, noted the date, June 14th, and made a precise entry in my personal notebook. Mark Vance attempted to audit Sentinel Daemon without root credentials. Risk factor, critical. The third and ultimate escalation arrived in the spring of 2026. The tech industry was consumed by the frenzy of generative artificial intelligence, machine learning platforms, and autonomous enterprise systems. Arthur and Mark fell completely under the spell of a slick, third-party software vendor called Synthetix Enterprise Solutions. Synthetix was selling a subscription-based, AI-driven supply chain management platform called *OmniMind*. It promised to eliminate the need for internal IT engineering departments entirely, using automated neural models to manage logistics, predictive routing, and server optimization at a fraction of the cost. For 6 months, Mark secretly fed dummy data into the OmniMind demo platform. He brought the sales representatives from Synthetix into the corporate office twice a week. They wore tailored navy blazers, carried slim silver laptops, and spoke in a hypnotic babble of jargon. Autonomous neural optimization, zero human oversight, dynamic API synthesis, and instant enterprise scaling. On July 20th, 2026, Mark called me into Arthur's executive suite on the top floor. The room offered a sweeping view of the Baltimore harbor, where giant blue container cranes lifted steel boxes off ships in a methodical, rhythmic dance. The room smelled of expensive leather, citrus air freshener, and Arthur's fresh espresso. Arthur was sitting behind his massive walnut desk. Mark was leaning against the windowsill, holding a slick, gloss-printed bound report with a gold foil logo. The future of Apex, autonomous infrastructure. Julian, Arthur began, leaning forward and joining his fingers into a pyramid. We're making a historic shift. The board has approved a complete digital migration. We are sunsetting the legacy Aegis system and replacing it entirely with OmniMind AI. Mark has spearheaded this deal. It's going to save the company $4.2 million annually in operational overhead. I stood opposite the desk, my hands tucked loosely into my pockets. OmniMind is a wrapper around a public large language model. Arthur, I said, my voice as flat and measured as a digital clock. It is designed to generate text and process static data sets. It cannot handle real-time concurrency for 96 container ships across 11 time zones. It does not understand the hardware handshakes at the physical terminals. If you pull Aegis offline, you will break the core hardware pipeline. Mark burst out laughing, stepping away from the window. God, you're predictable, Julian, Mark said, shaking his head with deep disgust. Every legacy dev says the exact same thing when their obsolete skills are phased out. The new tool can't handle it. Only my special magical code can do it. It's pathetic. We ran the synthetic benchmark tests. OmniMind processed 3 months of historical data in 4 minutes. It's superior to your custom junk in every single metric. Historical data is static, Mark, I replied, looking him straight in the eyes without blinking. Live operational data is a hurricane. Have you stress-tested the API handshakes with the Rotterdam port authorities under high packet loss conditions? We don't need to hand-code handshakes anymore, Julian, Mark snapped, his face reddening. The AI creates its own connections on the fly. That's the entire point of autonomous software. You've spent 15 years building a maze, only you know how to walk through, so you could feel indispensable. But the ride is over. Arthur raised a hand, stopping his son, though his own eyes were hard and cold as flint. We've already signed the contract, Julian, Arthur said flatly. Synthetix gets complete system control on Monday at midnight. We no longer require an internal lead systems architect. We are streamlining the department. And my severance? I asked quietly. Arthur picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk and slid it across the mahogany polish. I didn't pick it up, but I read it where it lay. It offered 2 weeks of pay, $2, $384.61 after taxes, in exchange for signing a blanket non-disclosure agreement, a 5-year non-compete clause, and a full release of all legal claims regarding my father's estate and the intellectual property of Aegis. That's insulting, Arthur, I said softly. That is generosity, Arthur countered, his voice dropping into a harsh, rasping register. You've been overpaid to maintain a legacy program for a decade. You take that document, you sign it, and you walk away cleanly. Or you refuse, and I terminate you for cause, insubordination and technological incompetence, and you leave with 0. And your mother loses her supplemental health coverage by the end of the month. I looked at Arthur. I looked at Mark, who was grinning with smug, quiet triumph. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my fist on the desk. I didn't threaten litigation. I need until Friday to pack my personal belongings from the basement server room, I said calmly. You have until Tuesday afternoon, Arthur said, turning his chair toward the window, dismissing me entirely. And don't touch a single line of code on your way out. The inciting act that crossed the line occurred 5 days later, on Tuesday, July 25, 2026. I spent those 5 days doing absolutely nothing to sabotage the system. I didn't need to. I didn't plant a virus. I didn't drop a database table. I didn't insert a single malicious line of logic into the repository. That would have been illegal, unethical, and entirely beneath me. Instead, I simply stopped performing the thousands of unscripted, undocumented human interventions that kept the fragile, sprawling monster of Apex logistics from tearing itself apart. I stopped manually running the asterisk sentinel asterisk thread synchronization daemon when the Rotterdam traffic spiked. I stopped manually patching the memory leaks in the legacy terminal hardware. I stopped manually approving the security certificate handshakes that expired every 72 hours between our servers and the fuel distribution networks in Hamburg. I simply let the machine exist exactly as it was coded, and as Arthur and Mark believed it existed. At 4:00 p.m. on Tuesday, Mark brought the entirety of the company's corporate staff into the third-floor atrium for what he billed as the Digital Genesis event. The atrium was a massive space with exposed brick, steel beams, and a 50-foot skylight. 64 employees gathered around a temporary stage, equipped with 2 giant monitors and a podium. Tables were lined with catered appetizers, chilled shrimp, sliders, and iced champagne in silver buckets. Arthur stood at the podium, flanked by 2 representatives from Synthetix Enterprise Solutions who wore matching tailored suits and crisp white shirts. Mark stood next to a giant red digital button mounted on a pedestal on the stage, a plastic, theatrical prop he had bought to represent the sunsetting of Aegis and the activation of Omni-Mind AI. Today, Arthur announced into the microphone, his voice echoing off the high glass ceilings, we cut the anchor that has tied Apex Logistics to the past. For 15 years, we relied on slow, manual, human-bound software architectures that held back our growth. Today, under the technical leadership of my son, Mark Vance, Apex becomes a fully autonomous, AI-driven global enterprise. The crowd clapped politely. Some of the older warehouse managers standing in the back looked uneasy, but the corporate marketing staff cheered enthusiastically. Arthur looked toward the back of the atrium, where I was standing near the elevator doors, holding a single brown cardboard box containing my personal belongings, a mechanical keyboard, my father's old copper pocket watch, a desk plant, and 3 notebooks filled with hand-drawn system schematics. Julian, Arthur called out over the public address system, his voice sharp and carrying across the quiet room. 64 pairs of eyes turned instantly to look at me in my faded gray sweater and worn slacks. Before we press this button, Arthur said, a sadistic, cruel smile touching the corners of his mouth, I want to thank you for your years of service as our legacy custodian. But as of 4:15 p.m., your access privileges are revoked, your role is eliminated, and your service is no longer required. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Then, he spoke the words that would echo through the entire industry for months to come. You are nothing more than a legacy dependency. We are sunsetting tonight, Julian. So hand over your badge before security escorts you into the alley like the rest of the trash. Mark slammed his hand down on the big red button. The giant monitors behind them flashed bright green. Aegis terminated. OMNIMIND AI initializing. System autonomy, 100%. The room erupted into applause. Champagne corks popped, splashing foam onto the polished concrete floor. 2 uniformed security guards walked up to me. I didn't wait for them to touch me. I took my plastic security badge off my neck, set it neatly on top of a nearby catering table next to a tray of half-eaten shrimp, held my cardboard box firmly under my arm, and walked out of the building without saying a single word. I walked down the external concrete steps into the cool, gray drizzle of the late afternoon. I didn't hurry. I didn't run. I walked 4 blocks to the bus stop, sat down on the metal bench and set my box on my lap. My chest did not heave. My hands did not shake. I took off my glasses, wiped the raindrops from the lenses with the hem of my shirt, put them back on, and drew a long, slow breath through my nose. The air smelled of wet asphalt, sea salt from the harbor, and exhaust fumes. This was the quiet pivot, the point where emotion ends and arithmetic takes over. When a man builds a machine from nothing, every screw, every wire, every invisible pulse of electricity belongs to his understanding. For 15 years, Arthur and Mark had treated my quietness as weakness, my patience as obedience, and my technical mastery as a simple commodity to be bought, stolen, or discarded. They believed that because they own the corporate registration papers, they own the reality of the architecture. They were about to learn the profound, terrifying difference between legal ownership and functional comprehension. I caught the 5:10 p.m. transit bus back to my modest 1,100-square-foot studio apartment in East Baltimore. The apartment smelled of old paper, lavender soap, and dry cedar. I set my box on the kitchen counter, watered my small potted fern, and boiled a kettle of water to make a pot of green tea. I sat down at my personal workstation, a clean, dual-monitor desk that had no connection whatsoever to the Apex corporate network. I opened a fresh, leather-bound notebook, capped my fountain pen, and began writing down a precise, chronological timeline of events, system variables, and financial contingencies. I did not feel anger. Anger is an expensive, inefficient emotion that consumes processor cycles without generating useful output. What I felt was a cold, crystalline clarity. Arthur had spent 15 years treating me like a ghost in his machine. Now, I was going to let him see what happens when the ghost leaves, and the machine is left alone with nothing inside it but his own ignorance. The countermove did not begin with a lawsuit or a public smear campaign. It began with meticulous documentation and a single phone call. At 7:00 p.m. on Wednesday morning, less than 48 hours after my termination, I called Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was my father's elder sister, a 71-year-old retired corporate tax attorney who lived in a stone cottage in Annapolis. She was a woman who spoke in crisp, measured sentences, wore silver hair pinned into a tight bun, and possessed a mind like a razor blade. She had been exiled from the family dynamic 20 years prior after calling Arthur a financially illiterate parasite during the execution of my grandfather's will. "Julian," Eleanor answered on the second ring. Her voice was as dry and sharp as autumn leaves. "I heard Arthur finally cut your throat. He terminated my contract on Tuesday, Aunt Eleanor," I said calmly, sipping my tea. "He replaced Aegis with an off-the-shelf AI model called OmniMind." Mark spearheaded the transition. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as she shifted in her armchair. "How long before the system collapses?" she asked plainly. "The Rotterdam Port Protocol SSL certificates expire at midnight tonight," I replied. The custom handshake script I wrote isn't in the public repository. It was running off a local virtual directory on my private workstation user profile, which was scrubbed when they deleted my account. The OmniMind platform will attempt to negotiate the connection using standard HTTP protocols. The Rotterdam automated gate systems will flag it as an unauthorized intrusion attempt and lock out all Apex cargo manifests globally. Expected total operational freeze, 72 hours. "What do you have, Julian?" she asked, her tone sharpening into legal precision. "I have everything," I said. Over the next 12 hours, I assembled a digital vault containing 15 years of meticulously preserved records. First, I compiled the intellectual property documentation. While Arthur had forced me to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding corporate trade secrets, he had made a fatal legal oversight. In 2012, to minimize corporate tax liabilities, Arthur had registered the core intellectual property of Aegis under a separate holding entity called *Vance Digital Systems, LLC *, an entity created under my father's name, for which I was the sole surviving beneficiary. Arthur had forgotten to transfer the patents and copyright registrations to Apex Logistics Solutions, Inc. when my father died. He had simply assumed that because I worked for Apex, Apex owned the software. Second, I compiled the financial ledger. For 6 years, Mark had been inflating the operational efficiency metrics of his department by reporting my unpaid overtime and custom software automation as AI-driven operational savings to the board of directors and prospective venture capital firm *, Vanguard Capital Partners *. Vanguard was currently in the final stages of closing a $150 million acquisition of a 40% equity stake in Apex. The entire valuation was predicated on the claim that Apex possessed a fully proprietary, fully automated, zero-human maintenance logistics platform. Third, I held the master cryptographic keys. Aegis was protected by a 24-layer cryptographic architecture. The private keys required to reassign the root hardware bridges, update the Port Authority security protocols, and decrypt the global database backups were stored on a physical, air-gapped U-by-key hardware security module, currently resting inside my pocket. At 2:00 p.m. on Thursday, Aunt Alina and I met in the conference room of her former law firm in downtown Baltimore. The room was lined with thick law volumes, smelling of old paper and leather polish. Accompanying us was Marcus Vance. My younger brother, who was 26, held a degree in forensic accounting from Johns Hopkins and worked as an auditor for a major financial institution. Marcus had spent 3 months quietly auditing Apex's public regulatory filings, SEC disclosures, and corporate tax returns at my request. "Here is the financial exposure," Marcus said, laying out 3 thick white binders across the mahogany table. Apex carries $85 million in short-term debt with First National Bank. The loan covenants stipulate that if operational downtime exceeds 12 consecutive hours, or if cargo throughput drops by more than 20% in any single fiscal quarter, the bank has the absolute right to call the entire $85 million principal balance due immediately within 48 hours. "And the vessel charter contracts?" Alina asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "Every cargo ship chartered by Apex carries a demurrage penalty clause," Marcus replied, pointing to a highlighted line in the contract. "If a ship is held at anchor outside a port because the electronic manifest cannot be verified, Apex pays a penalty of $45,000 per vessel, per day." They currently have 96 vessels actively moving across international shipping lanes. 96 vessels at $45,000 a day, Alina calculated softly, a grim, satisfied smile touching her lips. "That is $4.32 million per day in pure penalty fees, compounding every 24 hours. Plus," I added, "the perishable cargo contracts. 32 of those vessels are carrying refrigerated agricultural products bound for European supermarkets under strict delivery windows. If the cooling parameters aren't updated via the server handshake within 48 hours, the cargo spoils. Total liability, $112 million. Alina closed the binder with a firm asterisk thud. "We don't initiate litigation," Alina stated flatly. "We don't file an injunction. We simply draft the formal legal notice of intellectual property revocation and key ownership. We serve it directly to the board of directors and Vanguard Capital Partners the exact moment the system goes dark. Julian, you sit in your apartment, turn off your phone to unknown callers and wait." The collapse occurred with mathematical perfection. On Friday morning, July 28, 2026, at precisely 12:01 a.m., the SSL certificate for the Rotterdam Port Communications Bridge expired. The OmniMind AI platform, attempting to reconcile the broken connection, did what all large language models do when confronted with an unhandled hardware edge case. It hallucinated. It began generating synthetic network tokens and spamming the automated gate authority systems in Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, and Singapore with millions of malformed API requests. By 1:15 a.m., the port authorities in Rotterdam automatically flagged Apex Logistics Solutions as a source of a massive distributed denial-of-service (DDoS) attack. They completely severed all digital connections with Apex's IP addresses and issued an emergency maritime freeze. By 3:00 a.m., 96 container ships carrying over 180,000 steel cargo containers were stranded at sea, idling in international waters outside 32 major global ports, unable to dock, unload, or process manifests. By 6:00 a.m., the domestic trucking networks collapsed. Without the asterisk Sentinel daemon to manage the database synchronization, the automated dispatch systems in North America began assigning 4 different trucks to the same loading dock in Chicago, while leaving 2,000 trucks idling in distribution yards in Texas. Without route assignments, by 9:00 a.m., the physical offices of Apex Logistics Solutions had descended into complete, unadulterated terror. I spent Friday morning in my apartment. I made fresh coffee, read 3 chapters of a book on distributed systems architecture, and listened to the rain tapping against my window pane. At 11:30 a.m., my personal mobile phone began to ring. I didn't answer. The caller ID showed Arthur's private cell phone number. He called 7 times in 11 minutes. Then Mark called 6 times. Then came the text messages. Julian, answer your phone immediately. This is an executive order. 11:42 a.m. Julian, Mark made a minor mistake with the migration setup. We need you to jump on a quick Zoom call to give the Synthetics team the admin password. 11:58 a.m. Julian, ships are sitting outside Rotterdam. This is costing us $200K an hour. Where are the master route keys? 12:15 p.m. Julian, please answer. Arthur is losing his mind. We will talk about a raise. 12:45 p.m. At 2:00 p.m., Anna Leaner formally served the legal notice to the board of directors of Apex Logistics and the senior partners at Vanguard Capital Partners. The document was 40 pages long. It detailed that the core logic of Aegis was the exclusive intellectual property of Vance Digital Systems, LLC *, that all licenses had been revoked as of my termination. That OmniMind AI was operating on stolen proprietary algorithms, and that Julian Vance was the sole holder of the physical master keys required to unencrypt the core database. At 3:15 p.m., Vanguard Capital Partners officially froze their $150 million equity investment and issued a formal demand for an emergency audit. At 4:00 p.m., First National Bank issued a formal notice of covenant default, giving Apex Logistics 24 hours to restore operational capacity or face immediate loan acceleration and asset liquidation. At 5:30 p.m., the rain outside my apartment became a heavy, steady downpour. I sat in my armchair with a cup of Earl Grey tea, watching the water run down the glass. At 6:15 p.m., a black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the curb outside my apartment building, splashing dirty street water onto the sidewalk. The door knock was not the confident, booming rap of a corporate executive. It was a frantic, irregular, desperate rattle that sounded like a drowning man clawing at the hull of a ship. I took a slow sip of my tea, set the porcelain cup down on its saucer, walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the dimly lit, carpeted hallway were Arthur Vance and Mark Vance. They looked unrecognizable. Arthur's charcoal suit was soaked through with rainwater, sticking to his stooped shoulders. His hair, usually meticulously slicked back, was plastered across his forehead in wet gray strands. His face was gray, hollowed out, with dark purple sacs hanging beneath his bloodshot eyes. He smelled of heavy sweat, wet wool, and stale coffee. Mark stood behind him, shivering in a wet dress shirt without a jacket, holding a leather briefcase like a shield against his chest. His face was pale, his mouth twitching nervously, all his arrogance washed away by 72 hours of unmitigated catastrophe. "Julian," Arthur gasped, his voice raspy and choked with moisture. "Thank God you're home, thank God." I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I wore a simple black sweater, trousers, and leather slippers. My hands were relaxed at my sides. "Hello, Arthur." "Hello, Mark," I said softly, my voice completely level. "It's raining." "Julian, please," Arthur stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised in a pleading gesture that looked utterly alien on him. "We have to talk. The entire system is down. Rotterdam locked us out. Hamburg locked us out. We have 96 vessels sitting at anchor. The demurrage fees hit $6 million an hour ago. The European buyers are canceling $100 million in produce contracts. The bank is pulling our credit line tomorrow morning. I am aware, I replied calmly. Mark made an error, Arthur rushed on, pointing a trembling finger back at his son, who flinched. The Synthetics AI system, it didn't translate the security protocols correctly. It created a loop. The Synthetics engineers say they can't break the encryption without the root master keys. They said the database is sealed behind a 24-layer cryptographic wall. Julian. They said you hold the only key. I do, I said. Mark stepped forward, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager's. Julian, please, man, Mark cried out, his eyes wide and wet with tears. Vanguard canceled the funding. The board called an emergency meeting for 8:00 p.m. tonight to remove Dad and me from the company and turn over everything to the receivers. They're talking about filing criminal fraud charges against me for the metric reports. You have to give us the password. Just type the root password into my laptop and we can fix this right now. Mark tried to open his briefcase to pull out his silver laptop. I did not move. I did not raise my hand. I simply looked at Mark until his hands froze on the brass latches of his case. I don't work for Apex Logistics, Mark, I said, my voice dropping an octave into absolute, chilling stillness. I was sunsetted on Tuesday at 4:15 p.m. I am a legacy dependency that was cut loose. I hand-delivered my badge to security, as directed. Arthur looked at me, his chest heaving, water dripping from the tip of his nose onto his wet silk tie. Julian. Please, Arthur whispered, stepping closer, his eyes pleading with a desperate, pathetic intensity. We are family, your father. Your father would never have let the family business burn to the ground like this. Think of your father's memory. My father worked 80 hours a week in a grease pit so you could wear $600 suits, Arthur, I said, every word crisp, clear. And quiet as a winter morning. You paid him with promises, and when he died, you used his memory as a leash to keep me in a windowless basement for 15 years. You told me blood protects blood. But you treated me like trash. Arthur grabbed the edge of my doorframe, his knuckles turning white. What do you want? Arthur begged, tears finally spilling down his weathered, wet cheeks mixing with the rain. What do you want, Julian? I'll give you a salary, $300,000 a year. Senior Vice President title, equity, I'll give you 10% of the company right now. Apex Logistics Solutions is insolvent, Arthur, I replied. Your stock is worthless. Your bank line is called, your investors have pulled out, you don't have equity to offer. Then what will it take? Arthur sobbed, collapsing forward slightly, his head bowed. What is the price to get that master key right now? My consultation fee for Vance Digital Systems LLC is $42 million cash, I said without a single tremor in my voice. Paid via wire transfer, before I input a single character into a terminal. And a complete signed resignation from both you and Mark, surrendering all executive authority to the board-appointed receiver, effective immediately. Arthur stared at me, his mouth open in total. Paralyzed horror. 42 million, Mark gasped, trembling. That's everything Dad has left in personal reserves. That is the exact value of the proprietary software logic you stole from my father's estate over 15 years, I said. You have 30 minutes to decide. At 7:00 p.m., the Rotterdam Port Authority initiates the permanent cancellation of Apex's commercial docking licenses. After that, no key in the world will save your shipping lanes. I did not wait for his answer. I stepped back into my apartment and closed the door softly in their faces. At 6:52 p.m., my personal bank terminal notified me of an incoming wire transfer of $42 million from Arthur Vance's private asset escrow account. 10 seconds later, an encrypted email arrived from Aunt Alina containing signed, legally binding resignation documents from Arthur Vance and Mark Vance, abandoning all corporate roles, board seats, and voting control in Apex Logistics Solutions, Inc. alongside a total assignment of all Aegis software rights to Vance Digital Systems, LLC. I sat down at my desk. I unpocketed the small silver U-by-key hardware security module, inserted it into my USB terminal, and opened a secure SSH connection to the core servers. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, quiet speed. I didn't run Omni Mind. I deleted Omni Mind entirely from the server cluster with a single command. rm-rf/opt/synthetics/omnimind. I restored the original Aegis core repository. I manually executed the *sentinel* thread synchronization daemon. I signed the Rotterdam SSL certificate handshake using my private key, manually cleared the queue spikes in Antwerp, and re-established the secure hardware ports for the domestic trucking fleet. Within 12 minutes, the digital screens in 64 offices across 3 continents lit up green. The container ships in Rotterdam began their engine sequences and moved toward the docking slips. The dispatch systems in Chicago smoothly assigned 2,000 trucks to their proper routes. The global machine, restored to its master's hand, purred back to life. The public vindication occurred 3 weeks later, on August 15, 2026. The Emergency Restructuring Board of Apex Logistics Solutions, now operating under court-appointed receivership and stripped of the Vance executive leadership, held an extraordinary general meeting of shareholders and global trade partners at the Baltimore Convention Center. Over 500 representatives from major international shipping lines, venture capital firms, maritime port authorities, and industry trade press filled the grand auditorium. The new interim chief executive officer, a formidable, silver-haired logistics veteran named Catherine Mercer, stood at the main podium beneath a massive LED screen. For 15 years, Mercer announced into the microphone, her voice carrying absolute authority across the silent auditorium. Apex Logistics operated under the false pretense that its operational success was the product of executive management vision. An exhaustive independent forensic audit conducted by Vanguard Capital and federal regulatory authorities has revealed the truth. She clicked a remote. The giant screen displayed a single, comprehensive system architecture map of Aegis, featuring my name at the top as the sole inventor, author, and owner of the intellectual property. The board formally acknowledges that Apex Logistics Solutions was built, maintained, and saved entirely by the intellectual work of Julian Vance, Mercer stated clearly. We announce today that Apex has entered into an exclusive, multi-year $12 million annual licensing agreement with Vance Digital Systems, LLC, to utilize the Aegis platform moving forward. The auditorium broke into sustained, deafening applause. In the third row sat Arthur Vance and Mark Vance. They were accompanied by 2 defense attorneys. Arthur looked 10 years older, his eyes were dull, staring blankly at the floor as the crowd clapped. Mark sat hunched in his chair, his head bowed, unable to raise his eyes to the stage. I was sitting in the front row, flanked by Aunt Alina and my brother Marcus. I wore a tailored dark navy suit, custom-made, precise, and unpretentious. When Catherine Mercer invited me onto the stage to speak, I walked up the wooden steps slowly, adjusted the microphone to my height, and stood before the 500 people in attendance. I did not gloat, I did not mention Arthur by name, I did not raise my voice. A machine is only as strong as its foundation, I said into the quiet room, my voice calm, composed, and resonant. You can paint the walls gold, and you can put AI badges on the windows, but if you destroy the human architecture holding up the roof, the entire house falls. Respect the people who write the code, build the engines, and stay up through the night to keep the world moving. I stepped back from the podium, nodded once to the audience, and walked off the stage. In the aftermath, the consequences settled with absolute clinical finality. Arthur Vance surrendered his $4.5 million waterfront mansion in Annapolis to satisfy personal guarantees on defaulted loans. He now lives in a rented 2-bedroom apartment in suburban Virginia, living off a modest fixed pension. Mark Vance was formally barred by regulatory authorities from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded technology enterprise for a period of 10 years, following an SEC investigation into operational reporting fraud. He currently works as a junior entry-level logistics coordinator for a regional courier firm, earning $45,000 a year. Inputting tracking numbers into a terminal software system he cannot modify. Neither Arthur nor Mark ever sent a formal letter of apology. 2 weeks after the convention, Mark sent a brief, poorly worded text message asking if I could lend him $15,000 to pay off his BMW lease penalties. I did not reply. Their apologies or lack thereof ceased to hold any currency in my life the moment I closed my apartment door on that rainy Friday evening. Apex Logistics Solutions survived, restructured under new professional management, operating cleanly under the software license granted by Vance Digital Systems, LLC. My mother's medical care was permanently secured through a fully funded, independent private trust account I established with $5 million of the settlement capital, entirely removing her from any reliance on corporate favors. I used the remaining capital to establish Vance Systems Architecture Asterisk, an independent software design firm located in a beautifully restored 19th-century brick warehouse in South Baltimore. We employ 24 senior software engineers, system architects, and database managers. Every single engineer on my team earns a starting salary well above industry standard, holds genuine equity in the software they write, and is never required to work more than 40 hours a week. At the entrance of our server facility, engraved into a solid slab of brushed aluminum, are 6 words. The logic must earn its keep. I sit at my desk today in a sunlit corner office overlooking the Baltimore harbor. The air smells of fresh roasted coffee, cedar wood, and the cool sea breeze blowing through the open balcony doors. On my screen, 96 container ships move smoothly across digital ocean paths, their status indicators glowing a quiet, unbroken green. I lost 15 years of my life to the delusion that loyalty to toxic family was a substitute for self-respect. I lost the illusion that working in the shadows, while others take the credit, is a form of noble sacrifice. What I gained was complete, absolute sovereignty over my work, my mind, and my destiny. I understand now that true power does not come from title, position, or loud declarations made at public podiums. True power lies in the quiet, undeniable competence that keeps the world running when the lights go out. I am no longer a legacy dependency to be sunsetted. I am the architect of my own machine.